Hi, and welcome to Accessibility, Faster Sites and Processes. Today we're going to cover little information about me, what accessibility is, terminology and laws about accessibility, that your visitors do in fact have disabilities, how accessible sites are in fact faster websites, how to streamline accessibility for faster processes, how to measure your accessibility, how to test for accessibility, and then what to do next. Slides and links for this presentation and others are available at easya11yguide.com/learn. I'm Jen Harries from the Easy Alley Guide. I'm a DHS trusted tester, and I've been in accessibility for more than 5 years. The Easy Alley Guide helps agencies who know that web accessibility is important, but don't know how to actually get started implementing accessibility into their processes and producing accessible websites for their clients. We have an accessibility agency program to help agencies incorporate accessibility into all of their processes and really produce great results for their clients. We have both done with you and done for you services to help you at different stages of your accessibility journey. We want to help you move accessibility from a headache to a recurring revenue item. So what is accessibility? Accessibility is about allowing all people, regardless of their abilities, to use your website and to interact with you on social media and via email. Plenty of technology already exists to help people use the web, email, and social media. What we need to do as web developers is not put up barriers. Web accessibility is about your entire online presence. So wherever you have your content and you can control your content, you need to be considering web accessibility. So that means not just your website, but also your social media, including both your posts, your private messages, and your profiles, your emails, including your transactional, marketing, and direct email. Some definitions and terminology around web accessibility. WCAG is something you will hear constantly. That's WCAG, and that stands for Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. These are maintained by W3C, which is the World Wide Web Consortium. These are the same folks who make HTML and CSS. The current versions that are discussed in most laws are version 2.0, 2.1, and 2.2. Within these guidelines, they have different levels. Level A has the fewest requirements. Level AA incorporates everything in Level A and adds some more requirements. And finally, Level AAA has the most requirements, incorporating everything from A and AA. Generally speaking, AA is used in all of the laws. The current version of WCAG is 2.2 Level AA, but you will also hear 2.0 and 2.1 throughout this presentation as they apply to different laws. Compliance versus conformance is an important concept when it comes to accessibility, especially since accessibility affects the legal space. Compliance is about a specific law. An entire organization complies with an entire law. So this incorporates not just someone's web presence, but also their physical location, their processes, their hiring. It's a very all-encompassing term. Conformance is about guideline. A website conforms to a specific standard or a specific version of WCAG. So when you're talking to your clients and your customers, you need to make it clear the difference. You can talk about conformance of a website to WCAG in a specific version. You cannot talk to them about compliance. Speaking of legal matters, when it comes to lawyers and web accessibility laws, you need to be careful. Most lawyers don't know about web accessibility. It is a very new area of law, and when they went to law school, many of these laws did not exist. Some more terminology for web accessibility. A11Y is an abbreviation for accessibility. It removes 11 letters between A and Y, and it's commonly pronounced ally or ally. An overlay widget is a technology that exists between a website and an end user. It sits in the middle and it manipulates and modifies the website before it gets to the end user. In general, overlay widgets are not something you want to be using. The European Disability Forum released a statement in 2023 specifically saying overlays do not make the website accessible or compliant with European accessibility legislation. They do not constitute an acceptable alternative or substitute for fixing the website itself. So if you are dealing with Europe, you do not want to be using an overlay. Now let's get into the big law that's coming out in Europe in June of 2025. This is the European Accessibility Act. It is a directive and it affects private companies. This is a minimum requirement. Each member nation can implement a higher requirement than the minimum in the EAA. Several countries in their implementation of the EAA have included fines and jail time. A number of the penalties start at around 60,000 euros. The EAA applies to your business if you sell to Europe. That means it applies to you even if your business is outside of Europe. You are exempted if you are what's called a micro enterprise. That means you must meet both of the following criteria. You have less than 2 million euros in global annual revenue and less than 10 employees. What to do if you are selling products or services to the European market? You want to make sure that your website is conformant to WCAG 2.2 level AA. You also need to make sure that products and services such as plugins, themes, or SaaS products themselves are accessible. You are also required to include information regarding the product or service's accessibility alongside the rest of the product information. So if you have a page about a theme that you are selling, you have to include the accessibility information about the theme right along with the rest of the sales content. You also have to ensure that your documentation to support the theme, such as a wiki, a help desk, a knowledge base, etc., is also accessible. And finally, you have to make sure that your website includes an accessibility statement. Now we're going to talk about different types of disabilities that people have. First one is temporary. Pretty much everyone is going to experience a temporary disability at some point in their life. Some people will experience that daily, some weekly, some monthly. Examples of temporary disabilities involve headaches, medication side effects, substances such as alcohol or recreational drugs, injuries, and medical procedures. Even something like a headache can impair someone's ability to concentrate and focus and mimic many of the same challenges that people with conditions like ADHD face. Situational disabilities are a disability that someone encounters because of a situation they are in. Someone who is pushing a stroller is going to have a lot of issues with a staircase, as strollers and staircases don't mix. If someone is sitting in a loud cafe, they're not going to be able to listen to the audio on a video. If someone is outside walking their dog, it's bright and sunny and it's very washed out screen on their mobile phone. It's very difficult to read text, especially if that text has low contrast. Finally, if someone's in a moving vehicle, they may already be a little bit motion sick. If your website has a lot of scrolling, parallax, movement going on, that can significantly exacerbate the motion sickness and have people rapidly leaving your website. Finally, there are permanent disabilities. These are disabilities that people will live with for the rest of their lives. And there's two categories within permanent disabilities. There's those that are counted under most laws, and there are those that are not. The counted disabilities are frequently called a qualified disability in a law. And this means issues like being legally blind, being deaf, having a permanent limb issue. Whereas there are other permanent disabilities, such as carpal tunnel syndrome, being nearsighted or farsighted, being colorblind and unable to tell the difference between red and green, mild issues with ADHD, and other neurodiversity. These things affect people on a daily basis, but they don't get counted in the official numbers. In the United States, about 27% of the adult population has a counted disability, and about 40% of those people over 65. Your website visitors have disabilities. Exactly how many? Well, it's probably north of 20%, and in many cases can be much higher. The global disability market has north of $1.9 trillion in annual disposable income. That is a lot of money. The focus of the summit is on speed. So let's talk about accessibility and how it can help make your websites faster. Accessibility is about removing the barriers that prevent people from being able to use your website. By default, a plain HTML website is already accessible. The tools already exist. People don't need extra help. What they need us to do is make good choices that don't create any barriers for them. So how does this happen? What kinds of things make websites inaccessible? The first is lack of knowledge and lack of testing. If you don't know anything about web accessibility, you're probably causing problems for people. If you aren't regularly testing for it, you're also probably having problems. Lack of semantic markup and using accessible component libraries. The good news is there are several accessible component libraries out there that already exist. They are free, they're available for you to use, they're well documented. All you have to do is know where to find them. And the links are, of course, available. One of the keys of an accessible website is using semantic markup. This means that divs are not buttons. Don't just use generic HTML elements for everything. It is important to use the correct HTML elements for the right pieces of data. This allows the browser to do most of the work for you, which means you don't have to add a whole bunch of CSS and JavaScript to handle all these different conditions. Another way that websites become inaccessible is by adding lots of CSS and JavaScript to modify the content. And of course, design and content decisions that are made by people who just don't know about web accessibility. An important thing about web accessibility to remember is that Google and other search engines are screen readers. By optimizing your website for people with disabilities and people using assistive technology, you are also optimizing for search engines and SEO friendliness of your website. Well-written code is secure, accessible, and performant. Poorly written code requires a lot of remediation and additional code to correct. A plugin that created menus, specifically mega menus, was having a lot of difficulty trying to make their code work for accessible technology. The primary issue was their code was not semantic. They were not using properly ordered lists, and they didn't want to modify their HTML. Because of this, they ended up spending over 2 months trying to come up with a JavaScript solution that used a lot of extra code. Here's an example of a website that had accessibility improvements by getting rid of a theme forest theme and using a much more accessible and lightweight theme. The code was significantly simplified, even though the front end remained very, very similar. Before the updates, JavaScript execution time was 1.7 seconds. After, it was 0.9 seconds. Before, it had main thread work of 3.6 seconds. After, main thread work was 1.8 seconds, half of what it was previously. The DOM size was significantly reduced, from about 1,300 elements down to only 270. Simpler, faster websites. This is what we all want. Accessible websites frequently also have fewer visual elements. By reducing the amount of content that has to be loaded, we make these websites faster and decrease the file sizes and improve page load speeds. This also makes the website easier to use for people who have visual impairments and makes it easier for people who have poor internet connections. Another aspect of accessible websites is improved browser compatibility. By using semantic markup, you are using markup that is well supported by the browser. That means it does the work for you, and you don't have to write a whole bunch of extra JavaScript to perform these basic functions. This saves a lot of time in testing. Generally speaking, when you're testing a much more accessible website, cross-browser testing, including reporting and correcting, runs an average of about 2 minutes per page. I encounter about 1 cross-browser issue per 10 pages. Accessibility can also help you optimize your content, making it much easier for people to read. When there's less text and less complex text, it's easier for all users to read. Most people are skimming. They are only giving your website part of their attention, which means it needs to be simple. This also helps people whether they have a headache or ADHD. It just makes the website easier for people to consume. For example, on one website that we did some accessibility work on, after the improvements, customer service calls were reduced by 30%. Streamlining accessibility and incorporating it into the processes within your agencies. You want to incorporate accessibility early and often. You want to consider it at each step in your processes and make sure to test for it. We found that issues that aren't discovered until the end of development can cost 100 times more than if the same issue was found in design. It's really important to work on your checklists and your testing to make sure that things aren't missed. You need to know the settings and processes that you need to use for each of your tools. Many plugins can produce an accessible website, but only if you use the right settings. There are a lot of wrong settings that can create an inaccessible website. So it's very important that you document the right settings to use and incorporate these into your processes. This speeds up your operations and improves the consistency of the results that you produce. It's also important to check the terms of service for the tools that you are using to see if they mention accessibility. Here's an example of a tool's terms of service that are not good. You acknowledge and agree that the company does not warranty, assure, and/or guarantee that the software is or shall ever be compliant with the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Now, this is concerning for a few different reasons. Number one, they're talking about compliance with regard to guidelines. That is wrong language, which means whoever wrote this doesn't really understand accessibility and the correct language to be using. They should say conformant with the accessibility guidelines. This also tells us that this company is not going to prioritize accessibility. It's important to contact your vendors now before the European Accessibility Act goes into effect in June 2025. Here's an example email that you can send. I have a client who falls under the European Accessibility Act and requires a website that is WCAG 2.2 Level AA conformant. What information do you have on the accessibility conformance of whatever product you're asking about? Testing and measuring the accessibility of websites. There are 2 ways to test for accessibility. The first is automated, and that's testing that is performed by machines. And the second is manual, and that is testing performed by humans. Some popular examples of automated testing tools are WebAIM's Wave tool, Deque's Axe tool, and Google's Lighthouse tool. The Google Lighthouse tool is actually powered by Deque's Axe. Automated testing can find about half of the issues on a website. Deque had done a detailed study of 13,000 pages that they tested via both automation and manual testing. This was, of course, done with the Deque Axe tool. They found that about 80% of the WCAG issues came from about 15% of the WCAG criteria. Many agencies want to leverage automated testing, but the question is, how good is automated testing? They found that automation could find roughly half of the total issues on a website. From this study, they found that automation was quite good at finding issues with color contrast for text, parsing, and finding missing alt text. Unfortunately, automation was quite poor at form testing, button testing, keyboard testing, determining if labels and instructions are actually useful, determining if the order of content is correct, and non-text contrast, which meant that a lot of things were not found by automation that affect real people. Since a small number of WCAG criteria account for the vast majority of problems on a website, we can actually get pretty good coverage on testing by using a selected list of manual testing combined with our automated testing. Doing this, we can usually achieve about 90% of issue coverage and tackle most of the real problems that people face. This is called the quick audit testing process. During it, we test for images, form markup, links, and link state. We have 3 separate tests just for keyboard testing. We test on zoom, text, and resize, color contrast, autoplay and animations, captions and transcripts for video and audio, and we do screen reader testing. By following these manual steps, we're able to test for 90% or more of the actual issues on real web pages and the actual challenges that real people encounter when they try to use a website. Let's recap what we covered and what you can do next. We covered that accessibility for websites is about removing barriers. It applies to your whole online presence, which includes social media and email, not just your websites. Accessibility is about meeting user expectations, making sure that they have predictable experiences based on all of the websites that they've previously visited in their lives. We talked about accessibility terminology and the different laws that apply, such as the upcoming EAA that goes into effect in Europe in June of 2025. We talked about different types of disabilities that people have, and we talked about how websites become inaccessible. We covered that search engines care about the accessibility of your website, as search engines process your website in a very similar way to a screen reader. We talked about how accessible websites are faster and easier for people to use. We talked about adding accessibility to your processes, that you need to check with your vendors and find out what their accessibility policies are and what they have already done to improve their products to make them more accessible to people. And we talked about how you can test for accessibility, including both automated testing and how much it can cover and what it's good at, and what you need to do via manual testing. The slides for this presentation and the links from within this presentation are available at easya11yguide.com/learn. You can also learn more on the Easy Alley Guide YouTube channel. It has tutorials and a whole bunch of videos on common accessibility questions, including how on earth do I sell accessibility to my clients? The Easy Alley Guide website has tutorials, guides, tools, and services, and more for web agencies. And another learning experience for accessibility is WordPress Accessibility Day that is coming up October 9th and 10th. It's going to be 24 hours of accessibility talks.